taking it to an extreme dimension that is even crueler and more inhumane, with the aim of deliberately inflicting the greatest possible damage on Cuban families. During the first 14 months of President Joseph Biden's administration, the damages caused by this were estimated at $6.364 billion. That is over $15 million a day. Between August 2021 and February 2022, losses amounted to $3.806 billion, a record figure for a period of only 7 months. Had the blockade not existed, our gross domestic product could have grown by 4.5% during that same period. After more than 60 years, cumulative damages have been estimated at $217 billion at current prices. And, based on the price of gold, they account for $1.391 trillion. That is $1.391 trillion. What would Cuba be like today had it had those resources? What else could we have done? What would our economy be like? It's impossible to quantify the anxiety generated by blackouts and instability in the power system, supply shortages, and long queues to buy essential goods, or the obstacles posed to the life projects of families and particularly young people. The blockade also creates conditions that incite irregular, disorderly, and unsafe migration and the painful separation of families. It takes a toll on the lives of Cuban men and women and contributes to transnational organized crime and trafficking in persons. Mr. President, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the United States government applied temporary humanitarian exemptions to countries that fall victim to its unilateral coercive measures and other sanctions. Why was Cuba excluded from that temporary humanitarian relief? Worse still, while the COVID-19 pandemic was claiming millions of lives around the planet and was plunging my country into sorrow, the blockade was further tightened, thus generating further difficulties and delays in the delivery to Cuba of necessary medical inputs and equipment. Such inputs and equipment were needed to treat the disease and particularly to ensure the industrial level scale-up of Cuban vaccines. Even the purchase of medical oxygen in third countries was restricted. When the blockade prevented the supply of ventilators, Cuba developed them locally with prototypes of its own. So how is it that a small country like Cuba has been able to defeat the COVID-19 pandemic with resources and vaccines of its own making? At the worst point in the pandemic, and despite our limited resources, we cooperated with other nations by sending 58 medical brigades to 42 countries and territories. These joined the more than 28,000 Cuban dedicated health professionals who were already providing their services in 59 different countries. But the blockade also hampers the national production of antibiotics, analgesics, hypertensive drugs, medicines to treat cancer and cardiopathies, as well as several other basic medications, which had never before been in such short supply in our hospitals and in our pharmacies. Cuban children suffering from retina problems or glaucoma are not able to benefit from the laser system manufactured by the US company Iridex Corporation. If this condition worsens, it even runs the risk of causing blindness. Nor do our children have access to US-made biological heart valves. Low birth weight babies have to undergo open chest surgeries because the ultra-low profile catheters marketed by US firms such as Boston Scientific are not available in Cuba. There is no way in which the United States government can justify the implementation of a policy that deprives Cuban children suffering from cancer from receiving the right chemotherapy to treat their condition. Rising to the challenge of saving and preserving life in the midst of such difficult circumstances is only possible thanks to the governmental and collective efforts that have been made by our people for decades to build a high-quality, robust system of science and health, deeply humanist in nature, and that is accessible to all Cubans at absolutely no cost. Mr. President, the blockade has also exacerbated the financial restrictions and the limited access to credit to repair, invest in, and maintain the country's thermal power stations. Suppliers have significantly raised their prices, noting the risk that they run when transacting with Cuba. After 26 years of uninterrupted work, the German group Continental Reifen Deutschland decided to terminate its relations with Unión Cuba Petróleo. The French supplier, CNIM, notified us that it is no longer able to continue to supply the spare parts for the Antonio Guiterres thermal power station because they were unable to operate with a country subject to sanctions. Equally unceasing and obsessive in nature is the persecution of investments and financial and commercial transactions associated with our country. Between January 2021 and February 2022 alone, foreign banks reported 642 direct steps taken against the Cuban banking system. In the course of the last year, a significant number of banks in third countries have refused to process payments to the suppliers of the Cuban food import company, Alimport. With permits subject to legal restrictions, Cuba can buy through the regular commercial channels a limited amount of agricultural products in this country, but it is forced to pay in advance and without access to credit, which is also extremely difficult because at the same time our sources of income are blocked. Under this financial siege, incalculable efforts are being made by our government to guarantee the basic family food basket. More often than not, Cuban entrepreneurs are denied the use of electronic payment and commerce platforms. Our nationals based in different latitudes are not allowed to open personal bank accounts for the sole reason of being Cuban. Financial persecution has been further stepped up with the arbitrary and fraudulent inclusion of our country in the unilateral list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism issued by the State Department. This exponentially increases the so-called country risk and forces us to pay twice the normal price for commodities in the international market. Such action against a country that has been a victim of terrorism is inadmissible. This country today is still suffering because of the incitement to violence and the commission of terrorist acts from US territory. And yet our conduct has been impeccable, and we have been recognized as having firmly rejected and persecuted any form or manifestation of terrorism. This was a lethal measure imposed by the former Republican administration only 9 days before leaving the White House. The current US president could amend that with just a signature. That would only be morally and legally right. Mr. President, the extraterritorial impact of the blockade is also harmful to the sovereignty of the countries that you represent. It violates your national laws, subjects your countries to United States courts' decisions under Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. It imposes sanctions on your business people and prevents access to US ports by third country vessels that have touched down in Cuban ports. It also prevents subsidiaries of US companies in third countries from trading with Cuba. It prohibits exports to Cuba of products manufactured by any country if they have 10% or more of US components. And it excludes products manufactured in third countries if they contain Cuban raw materials. Who could affirm truthfully that the United States is one of Cuba's trading partners? We do not blame the blockade for all of the difficulties that our country is facing today. But those who deny its very serious impacts, or who fail to recognize that it is the main cause of the deprivation, scarcities, and hardship suffered by Cuban families, would be failing to tell the truth. Mr. President, the United States controls the most powerful media and hegemonic digital technological platforms. It uses them in a virulent disinformation and disparagement campaign against Cuba. It resorts to the most diverse methods of non-conventional warfare, using our children, our young people, and our artists as the targets of this political and media bombardment. The United States government allocates tens of millions of dollars from the federal budget, as well as some additional covert funds. It also recruits government and private institutions to finance the political operators who launch these disinformation, hatred, and destabilization campaigns on social media against Cuba. On the 24th of October this year, the US transnationals Twitter and Meta, or Facebook, one of whose main executives was the former campaign manager for an anti-Cuban Republican senator, simultaneously took steps to censor Cuban public media and its users. They labeled several publications limiting their reach on social media and deleted the accounts that were critical of the United States destabilizing action against our country. This was a selective, well-coordinated step, violating the rights of Cubans to freedom of expression. It reflects the subordination of these companies to the designs of United States politicians. Mr. President, on the 22nd of July this year, at the closing of the 9th session of the National Assembly of People's Power in its 9th legislature, at this meeting, the President Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez affirmed, and I quote, "Cuba's track record in the development of its foreign relations shows that the promotion of peace, cooperation and solidarity are defining characteristics of our international projection." We've demonstrated this in our Latin American and Caribbean region, and also in other parts of the world. End quote. The current US administration does not have a Cuba policy of its own. It is acting through inertia, and it has continued to implement the maximum pressure policy established under the Donald Trump administration. Over the last few months, it has taken steps to adjust some of the irrational restrictions imposed on United States flights to Cuba, on remittances and consular procedures. These are positive steps, but they are very limited in their scope and implementation. They in no way change the policy or the economic, commercial and financial measures. The blockade, which has been tightened to the most extreme degree, continues to be the central element defining US-Cuba policy. The Cuban government is ready to move forward towards a better understanding with the government of the United States and to develop civilized and cooperative relations based on mutual respect and without detriment to our sovereignty. I reiterate the appeal made by our Army General Raúl Castro Ruiz to the government of the United States in 2017 for it to, and I quote, "remove the obstacles that prevent or restrict relations between our peoples, the families and citizens from both countries. We should learn the art of coexisting in a civilized manner, despite our differences." End quote. Even in the midst of the inhumane limitations imposed on us by the blockade, Cuba will never renounce its socialist system of social justice, which was confirmed through a free and universal constitutional referendum in 2019. We will always defend the full enjoyment of all human rights by all of our citizens. We will never accept the attempted imposition of alleged paradigms of democracy or any other culture different from the Cuban culture. With the very same energy with which we defend the inalienable right of every country to choose its political, economic, and social system, we demand respect for ours. Faithful to the legacy of Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro Ruiz, in Cuba there will always be, I quote, "a government of the people, for the whole people," and "a revolution of the humble, with the humble, and for the humble." Undeniable evidence of this is the most recent demonstration of a truly democratic, participatory, and inclusive exercise in our country. In a popular referendum, Cuban people voted in favor of a new, modern and progressive families code, one of the most advanced in the world. This stands as irrefutable proof of a vocation which takes into account the views of all Cuban men and women without any form of discrimination. Our country has always kept up with the times based on the principle of changing everything that needs to be changed, in forging a sovereign, independent, socialist, democratic, prosperous, and sustainable nation. In the development of our socialist, rule of law-based, social justice, democratic, independent, and sovereign state. We advocate for increased involvement of our young people and all of our citizens in general in the political, economic, social, and cultural processes of the country. We are making progress in decentralizing our economy and empowering state socialist enterprises. Thousands of small and medium-sized private and state companies have been created. We are promoting science, technology, and innovation. We are delivering on the widespread rollout of ICTs in our society and social communication as the pillars of our administration. More opportunities are being offered for foreign investment as part of our development policy. Cuba is being continuously renewed. What remains unchanged, anchored in the past, and isolated, is the US blockade. We highly value the support from numerous governments, personalities, solidarity movements, political, social, and popular organizations from all over the world in the face of the injustice committed against Cuba. Mr. President, we deeply appreciate the commitment and the expressions of Cubans and Cuban descendants in all corners of the world, even in the United States. Their voices have been raised in defense of Cuba's sovereign rights and against the implementation of this policy. We also thank all of those who have expressed their support to our country. That in the midst of the difficulties posed by recovering from the grave trail of destruction left behind by Hurricane Ian in the western provinces in September last. Hundreds of thousands of our compatriots suffered the hurricane's impact. A total of 119,048 houses were damaged. Huge swathes of farmland were destroyed, and our power and communications infrastructure were severely affected, among other damages. We will continue to gratefully accept any emergency assistance offered to our people without any preconditions. We are grateful for the noble and humanitarian efforts made by US organizations, movements, and groups, members of Congress and personalities, by the Solidarity Movement and civil society organizations. Such parties, in the face of the scale of the havoc wrought by the hurricane, have asked President Joseph Biden to temporarily lift the unilateral coercive measures against our country and to authorize the processing of donations by US banks and the purchase of materials to rebuild the affected areas. Mr. President, permanent representatives, distinguished delegates, millions of Cubans are watching right now what is going on in this room. They have heard your statements and will be following your votes closely. On their behalf, I should thank the statements against the blockade made by dozens of heads of state and government and other dignitaries and other speakers in these general debate sessions. I also thank those speakers in the sessions yesterday. In brief, when casting your votes, you would not only be taking a stand on a vital issue for Cuba and all Cubans, you will also be voting in favor of the United Nations Charter and international law. You will be taking a stand in support of reason and justice. Let Cuba live in peace. Cuba would be better without the blockade. Every Cuban family would be better off without the blockade. United States citizens will be better off without the blockade. The United States would be a better country without the blockade against Cuba. The world would be better off without the blockade. I respectfully ask you to vote in favor of draft resolution A/77/L5, entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. I do this on behalf of the courageous and noble people of Cuba who, despite all of the adversities, haven't been nor will ever be defeated. I do so on behalf of our children, our young people, who are against these policies of hate, but who suffer their cruel effects. I do so on behalf of the generations of Cuban men and women who have been born or are yet to be born under the cruelest and most long-lasting system of coercive measures ever applied against any country, which should be abolished for the good of us all. Thank you very much.